In this first lesson of the Octatrack series, we're going to cover some of the basics of the machine. Let's start with an overview of its functions. The Octatrack is a dynamic performance sampler, which means it not only can process samples, but do so much more. The main task the Octatrack performs is processing samples, routing audio, so essentially acting as a mixer, capturing live loops, processing effects, and performing its many MIDI functions. Let's turn to the rear panel to talk about the layout. The power cable port is here. This is what you plug your power supply into, which is either a 12-volt power supply if you have a Mark II, or a 6-volt if you have a Mark I. Next is your power switch, where you turn your machine on or off. You have the USB port to connect your Octatrack to the computer to do things like upload samples or delete files. Here's the drive for your compact flash card. This is your main storage for the Octatrack, besides the internal RAM storage, which I'll talk about later. These are your 4 inputs, A, B, C, and D. Next are the 2 main outs and 2 Q outs. The Q outs are useful for things like DJing because they're not routed to the mains. You can change a setting in the project menu to turn the Q outs into main outs, so then you essentially have 4 main outs on the Octatrack to work with. Next you have your MIDI in, out, and through. In, out, depending on how you plug it in, will dictate whether the machine is acting as MIDI master or slave. Through copies the MIDI message from the master so you can have a chain of machines all responding to the MIDI master clock and messages. Let's move to the panel layout. The Octatrack has 8 tracks located here. They can either be audio or MIDI depending on if MIDI mode is active, and they act independently of one another. You can select any of the 8 tracks by pressing the corresponding key, which will be indicated by a lit red LED. This is the headphones volume control. And this is the tap tempo. You can set the tempo manually by pressing the key and turning the level knob, or by tapping a tempo. After 4 consecutive taps, the average tempo of the taps is set. The crossfader is located here. This is a very powerful tool. It moves between scene A and scene B. You can assign parameters like effects to each and crossfade between them, or you can fade out of your song into the next track. Basically, there's a lot of different things you can do with this feature. Next up are the trig keys 1 through 16, which make up the sequencer. The sequencer has many uses. It's where you place your samples, build your beats, trig the start of your recordings, etc. This is where record, stop, and play are executed. These are the 6 data entry encoders, or data entry knobs. They correspond to the values you see on the screen. So here you can see that encoder C corresponds to the length, A affects the pitch, and so on. The level knob sets the overall volume of the active track. Here are the recording buttons 1, 2, and 3. Recording buttons 1 and 2 are used for real-time recordings of external inputs, whereas recording button 3 is used for real-time recordings of internal sources. You have to press function plus any one of the 3 recording buttons to pull up a menu. Function is essentially shift. All of the functions written in gray below the key will activate when pressing function plus the key. We'll go over the functions in gray throughout the course. The arrow keys allow you to move up, down, left, or right. Yes and no are for yes and no functions. Consider yes to be more like enter and no like exit. Q, when pressed with a track, will cue that track. Audio is then routed to the Q outputs. The project button is where all the main menus are located. We'll go through those in detail throughout the course. When pressed, the MIDI button turns the Octatrack to MIDI mode. That means the 8 audio tracks become 8 MIDI tracks, and all the effects including LFOs and track parameter pages correspond to MIDI. Here are the 5 setup pages or track parameter pages. They contain different settings that affect each machine, like volume control, pitch control, LFOs, and so on. The track parameter pages change depending on which type of machine you have loaded to the track. Next is the page and scale. This shows the active pattern page. The LEDs indicate which page is playing. Function plus the page key will bring up the scale setup menu. This is where you select the track length and time signature. The pattern key is located here. When pressed along with any of the 16 trig keys, allows you to select between any of the 1 through 16 patterns. This is where you choose between any of the 16 banks available. The default is bank 1. You must press the bank key, select any trig between 1 through 16, then select a pattern in order to activate the bank. This is the parts menu. This is where you can choose between one of 4 parts. We'll discuss this powerful feature in a later lesson. Next is the arranger. This is basically song mode. This is where you arrange all of your patterns to play consecutively or customize it depending on how you have it set up. You can do many different things here like loop, change pattern lengths, and only play certain parts of patterns. The mixer button gives you quick access to the mixer mode. In this setting, the headphones output and inputs A, B, and CD can be controlled. When this menu is active, tracks can also be muted and soloed by pressing the corresponding trig keys. AED is the quick access audio editor button. This is where you do things like view, trim, normalize, or slice your samples. So these are the main features of the panel layout. Now let's take a look at the user interface. First, you have the playback position. This lets you know whether grid record mode is on or off, indicated by a record icon. Next, there's playback status. This tells you with the corresponding icon whether you're stopped, in playback mode, or recording. Here in the lower left corner, the active track parameter page and machine are shown. Here's where the active pattern is listed. In this case, it's A1. The 4-bar icon here will tell you which trig mode you're in. We'll talk about that in depth a little later. This is the position of the crossfader and which scenes are currently active. This lists the current sample and part that is active on the track. The machine assignment status shows which machine is active, depending on which icon is highlighted. This is the volume level for the track. This shows the BPM or tempo. And here are the 6 data entry encoders, which we've already covered. So this concludes the first lesson on the basics of the Octatrack. Thanks for joining and keep an eye out for lesson 2.